It was a crisp autumn afternoon in downtown Chicago, and Brightmart Superstore was bustling with customers. The scent of freshly baked bread from the in-store bakery mingled with the faint aroma of coffee from a nearby kiosk. Shoppers pushed their carts down aisles lined with brightly colored displays, their conversations blending into a symphony of daily life. At one of the checkout counters stood Samantha White, a woman in her mid-30s with neatly tied blonde hair and a sharp, scrutinizing gaze. She had worked at Brightmart for over a decade and had seen all kinds of people walk through its automatic doors. Over the years, she had developed a keen instinct, or so she believed, for spotting trouble. She took great pride in her ability to identify potential shoplifters, though her assumptions were often based more on appearance than actual evidence. That afternoon, as she was scanning items for a middle-aged woman, her eyes flicked up toward the entrance. A tall black man in his late 50s walked in. He was dressed in a simple yet elegant navy blue blazer, dark slacks, and polished black leather shoes. His presence was calm and self-assured, his shoulders squared, his steps deliberate. However, what caught Samantha's attention was not his demeanor but his skin color. Her jaw tightened slightly. He doesn't look like he belongs here, she thought. The man picked up a shopping basket and moved through the store, browsing the shelves with quiet interest. Samantha's gaze followed him with increasing suspicion. She noticed that he was looking at some of the more expensive items: watches, perfumes, electronics. A little voice in her head immediately started whispering warnings. Probably casing the store, she thought, looking for something to pocket when no one's watching. When he picked up an expensive silver wristwatch from a display, turning it over in his hands as if examining its craftsmanship, she made up her mind. This man is up to something. By the time he arrived at the checkout line, her patience had worn thin. She was ready. "Next in line," she called. The man stepped forward and placed his items on the conveyor belt. The moment she saw the watch among his purchases, her temper flared. "Sir," she said, her voice laced with a sharp edge, "I'm going to have to see some ID for that watch." The man raised an eyebrow. "Excuse me?" "You heard me," she said coolly. "We've had issues with people trying to steal expensive merchandise. Just a routine security check." His face remained calm, but his eyes darkened slightly. "Are you accusing me of stealing?" Samantha folded her arms. "I didn't say that. But if you don't have a receipt for that watch, I'm going to have to call security." The murmuring of nearby customers grew louder. A few of them turned their heads, sensing that something was happening. "I haven't even purchased it yet," the man pointed out. "How could I have a receipt?" "Exactly," Samantha snapped. "So why were you holding onto it for so long? People don't just stand around with a $200 watch in their hands unless they're planning something." By now, the attention of nearby customers had fully shifted to the scene unfolding at the checkout. The store manager, Mr. Holloway, a thin, balding man in his 40s, rushed over, sensing trouble. "What's going on here?" he demanded. Before Samantha could answer, the man exhaled a slow breath and pulled out his wallet. He flipped it open and held up an identification card. The moment Mr. Holloway saw it, his face turned ghostly white, because the ID didn't belong to just any customer. It belonged to Michael Carter, the mayor of Chicago. A tense silence fell over the checkout line. Samantha's smirk vanished in an instant, replaced by a look of shock. Michael Carter, the long-standing and well-respected mayor, stood before her, waiting for an explanation. "Mr. Carter, Mayor Carter, Mr. Holloway stammered, his face drenched in sweat. The other customers gasped, whispering among themselves. Some of them pulled out their phones, recording the moment. Samantha's heart pounded violently in her chest. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. The mayor's expression was calm but icy. His eyes carried the weight of 1,000 injustices, the kind that black men had faced for generations. He had encountered situations like this before, assumptions made about him, suspicions cast on him simply because of the color of his skin. But today, It wasn't happening in some hidden corner of society. It was happening in front of the entire city. You assumed I was stealing because I'm a black man, didn't you? He asked, his voice steady but piercing. Samantha's lips pressed together. I was just doing my job, she muttered, though her confidence had crumbled. Was that your job? He asked. To accuse customers without evidence? To humiliate them based on your own prejudices? It wasn't like that, she stuttered. Then tell me, what was it like? Samantha had no answer. Mr. Holloway grabbed her elbow and pulled her aside, lowering his voice but speaking with urgency. Are you out of your damn mind? He hissed. Do you realize who you just insulted? Her face burned with shame. The mayor turned to the gathered crowd. Ladies and gentlemen, let this be an example of what unconscious bias looks like. He said, I came here today to shop, just like any other citizen. Instead, I was treated like a criminal by the very people who are supposed to serve the public. Applause erupted from some of the customers. Others shook their heads at Samantha, their gazes dripping with disgust. As Michael Carter picked up his things and walked out, he left behind a moment that would haunt Samantha for the rest of her life. Within an hour, the video had gone viral. The internet exploded with outrage. The hashtag #FireSamanthaWhite began trending nationwide. News outlets picked up the story, airing the humiliating footage on primetime television. Samantha's phone was flooded with messages, some from acquaintances who were horrified, others from strangers who threatened her. Her employer issued an official statement, announcing that she had been placed on immediate suspension pending investigation. Samantha locked herself inside her tiny apartment, watching her world collapse. The comment sections were brutal. She got exactly what she deserved. This is why we need better anti-racism training. She shouldn't just be fired. She should be sued. Samantha buried her face in her hands. For the first time, she felt the weight of her own prejudice crushing down on her. Samantha's nightmare had only just begun. By the next morning, her face was everywhere on news sites, social media, TV segments. Reporters gathered outside her building. Then came the phone call from Brightmart's corporate office. Ms. White, due to the overwhelming public backlash, we have no choice but to terminate your employment, effective immediately. Samantha's breath caught in her throat. She had just lost everything. And this was only the beginning. Samantha White had never been a household name until now. The day after the incident at Brightmart, she woke up to the blaring sound of her phone vibrating nonstop. Hundreds of notifications flooded her screen. She groggily reached for her phone, hoping it was all just a bad dream. But as soon as she unlocked it, the reality hit her like a freight train. Her name was everywhere. Racist cashier humiliates black mayor, fired from job. Employee at Brightmart exposed for racial profiling. Watch the viral video. Public demands Brightmart take action. #FireSamanthaWhite trending. Her face had been plastered all over social media. There were screenshots of her looking smug at the checkout counter, memes mocking her, and worst of all, video compilations of her past online comments, where she had made ignorant remarks about different races and cultures. Her stomach tightened into a painful knot. She had never thought of herself as racist. Sure, she had opinions about certain people, but she believed she was just being cautious, realistic. But now, seeing herself through the eyes of the world, she realized that everyone thought she was a monster. The comment sections were brutal. She should never work in retail again. People like this are why racism is still alive. Fire her? She should be in jail for discrimination. Then, there were the death threats. If I ever see you in public, it's over for you. I hope your life is ruined. You should be ashamed of yourself. I'd rather die than be you right now. A cold sweat broke out on her skin. She checked her emails. Her inbox was flooded with hate mail. People had found her address, posting it online. Her heart hammered in terror. She rushed to her front window, peering through the blinds. Outside, A small group of reporters was already gathering, microphones in hand, waiting for her to step out. Her hands trembled. She had seen people get cancelled online before, but she had never imagined she would be one of them. And it was only going to get worse. By noon, her worst fear came true. Her landlord called. "Miss White." His voice was cold, clipped. "Given the current situation, I'm afraid I have to ask you to vacate your apartment within the next 30 days. "What?" Samantha's blood ran cold. "You can't do that. I've never missed rent. This is a family-friendly building," he said firmly. "And after everything that's been posted online, I can't risk having you here. People know where you live. I won't have that kind of attention on my property." "But The call went dead. She stared at the screen. Numb. Fired. Evicted. Hated by the world. She had never felt so alone. Desperate. She reached out to her closest friends. She called Karen, her old coworker from Brightmart. "Karen." Don't call me." Karen's voice was harsh. "I saw the video. I can't believe you." Samantha's heart dropped. "But You've always said things like that." Karen snapped. "I ignored it before. But now, the whole world sees who you really are." Click. Karen hung up. Samantha stared at her phone. She tried 3 more friends. All of them ignored her calls. She was truly alone. And the world wasn't done punishing her yet. For the next 2 weeks, Samantha barely left her apartment. She lived in constant fear. Every knock on her door made her flinch. Every time her phone buzzed, she expected more threats. Then came the rejection emails. She had applied to 10 different jobs, hoping anyone would hire her. But every reply was the same. "Dear Miss White, thank you for your application. Unfortunately, we are unable to proceed with your candidacy at this time." One company even replied bluntly, "We do not tolerate discrimination at our workplace. We will not be considering your application." She couldn't believe it. Her entire life was falling apart. Her savings were running out. Her reputation was destroyed. And for the first time, she was starting to realize something horrible. Maybe, just maybe, she had done something truly wrong. One night, as Samantha sat in her dark, empty apartment, staring at her unopened mail, her phone buzzed. A new email. She almost ignored it, until she saw the sender, Michael Carter. Her hands shook as she clicked it open. "Miss White, I assume you've had a difficult few weeks. I do not wish to add to your suffering, but I believe this moment could serve as an opportunity for growth. I am inviting you to attend a program on racial awareness and bias education. This program has changed lives before. If you are willing to learn, I am willing to help. Consider this your second chance. Sincerely, Michael Carter." Samantha stared at the message. Her chest tightened with emotion. After everything she had done, after all the humiliation, the insults, the damage, Michael Carter was offering her a chance to change. A chance to learn. A chance to become better. Tears burned at the back of her eyes. For the first time in weeks, she saw a glimmer of hope, a way forward. But the question was, did she have the courage to take it? Samantha sat staring at the email from Michael Carter for what felt like hours. A month ago, she would have laughed at the idea of attending a racial awareness program. She had never seen herself as racist. She had just been careful, cautious. That was what she had always told herself. But now, after losing her job, her reputation, her friends, and even her home, she wasn't so sure anymore. A deep, gnawing voice in her mind whispered, "What if they were right about you? What if you have been blind this whole time?" Her pride screamed for her to ignore the email, but her desperation told her otherwise. This might be the only person willing to help her. Her fingers trembled as she typed her response. "Mr. Carter, I don't know if I deserve a second chance, but I want to try. Please let me know when and where the program takes place. I will be there." She hesitated before hitting send. A part of her felt like this was admitting defeat. But another part, one she hadn't acknowledged before, felt something she couldn't quite name. Maybe it was relief. The next morning, Samantha received a response with details. The program was held at a community center on the south side of the city, a place she had never even considered visiting before. She almost backed out a dozen times before finally forcing herself out of the apartment. The neighborhood felt foreign to her. The people, the energy, the murals painted on brick buildings. It was all different from the suburban world she had always known. When she stepped into the community center, she was greeted by a young black woman in her late 20s. "Welcome," the woman said, offering a warm but cautious smile. "You must be Samantha White." Samantha hesitated, feeling the weight of the stares in the room. She recognized some of these faces. They were people who had spoken out against her online. She swallowed hard. "Yes, I'm Monique Patterson," the woman said, extending her hand. "I'll be guiding you through this program. Are you ready to begin?" Samantha took a shaky breath. For the first time in her life, she said, "I don't know, but I want to try." The first session of the program was nothing like Samantha had expected. She had imagined a lecture, maybe a video about racism in history. Instead, Monique led a discussion circle, a group of about 15 people, most of whom were black or other minorities. Samantha was the only white person in the room. Monique started with a simple question: "What does racism mean to you?" Samantha felt paralyzed. She had never thought about it beyond news stories or vague ideas about history. But as the others in the group began speaking, she heard stories that shook her to her core. Jamal, a teacher, spoke about being followed in stores as if he were a criminal. Renee, a young college student, recalled how a professor dismissed her ideas in class but praised her white classmates for saying the same thing. Marcus, a father, talked about how he had to teach his 10-year-old son how to behave around police officers to avoid being seen as a threat. Each story made Samantha feel smaller and smaller. Then, Monique turned to her. "Samantha, do you think what you did to Michael Carter was racist?" Samantha's throat tightened. She wanted to say no, to defend herself, to claim it was just a misunderstanding. But she had spent the last few weeks being called a racist by the entire world. Now, sitting here, listening to these stories, she realized something. She had done exactly what these people were talking about. She had judged Michael Carter before he even spoke. She had assumed he was a thief based on nothing but her own prejudices. Tears burned at her eyes. I think I was," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. It was the hardest thing she had ever said. But the moment the words left her mouth, she felt something inside her break open. For the first time, she saw herself the way others saw her. And it was horrifying. The program was not easy for Samantha. Every session forced her to confront things she had never questioned before, the privileges she had taken for granted, the biases she had never noticed, the microaggressions she had committed without thinking. She started remembering moments from her past, things she had brushed off before. The time she clutched her purse when a black man walked past her on the street. The way she had complimented a black coworker on how articulate she was, not realizing how condescending that sounded. The jokes she had laughed at without realizing how harmful they were. She began to see patterns in her thoughts, her words, her actions. The realization was painful. She had spent her whole life believing she was a good person. But what if being a good person wasn't just about not using slurs? What if it was about the little things, the assumptions, the biases, the things she hadn't even noticed? One night, after another difficult session, she sat alone in her apartment, staring at her reflection in the mirror. For the first time, she didn't recognize herself. And for the first time, she wasn't sure if she liked who she had been. After weeks in the program, Samantha received another email from Michael Carter. "Miss White, I hear you have been attending the program consistently. I would like to meet with you in person. I believe we have unfinished business." Samantha's heart pounded. Meeting him again felt terrifying. The last time they had stood face to face, she had humiliated him. Now, she was the one who had been publicly shamed. When she arrived at his office, She expected anger, resentment, maybe even a lecture. Instead, he greeted her calmly, offering her a seat. "I'm not here to punish you, Miss White," he said. "I just want to ask you one thing. What have you learned?" Samantha took a deep breath. "That I was blind," she admitted. "I thought racism was just about hating someone outright. I never realized how much of it is about assumptions, power, and history. I judged you before I even knew you. And I hurt you." Michael studied her for a moment before nodding. "You have a long way to go," he said. "But acknowledging the problem is the first step." Samantha swallowed. "Do you think I can fix what I've done?" Michael's expression softened. "You can't erase the past," he said. "But you can choose what you do with your future." For the first time in months, Samantha felt like maybe she had a future after all. Samantha White left Mayor Michael Carter's office with a strange mix of emotions. She had braced herself for anger, for judgment, maybe even for contempt. Instead, he had spoken to her calmly, with patience, almost as if he believed she could change. It was the first time in months that someone had looked at her as a person, not just a villain on the internet. But his words still echoed in her mind. "You can't erase the past, but you can choose what you do with your future." She knew she couldn't simply walk away from this experience and go back to her old life. But she had no idea how to make things right. That evening, she sat in her tiny, nearly empty apartment, a far cry from the comfortable life she once had. Her savings were running out. Her job prospects were non-existent. And yet, for the first time in months, she wasn't thinking about herself. She was thinking about what came next. The next day, she reached out to Monique Patterson, her instructor at the Racial Awareness Program. "I need to do something," Samantha admitted when they met at the community center. "Not just for myself, but for the people I've hurt. But I don't even know where to start." Monique gave her a long, searching look. "Change takes time," she said finally. "You don't get to just fix things overnight. But if you're serious about making amends, there's a way you can start." Monique handed her a flyer. Samantha frowned as she read it. "Community Outreach Initiative Mentorship Program for At-Risk Youth." She looked up at Monique, confused. "What does this have to do with me?" "You spent your whole life inside a bubble," Monique said. "This program pairs volunteers with young people who need guidance. You want to change? Step outside your comfort zone and learn about the people you've never cared to understand before." Samantha hesitated. Did she have the right to do this? But in her heart, she knew this was where she had to start. Samantha arrived at the community center the next afternoon, feeling completely out of place. The room was filled with teenagers from different backgrounds, some of them joking, others eyeing her warily. An older black woman, Ms. Johnson, the program coordinator, greeted her with an unreadable expression. "So you're the one Monique told me about," she said. Samantha nodded, suddenly nervous. Ms. Johnson sighed. "Look, I won't sugarcoat this. Not everyone is happy that you're here. People know who you are. They know what you did." Samantha swallowed hard. "But," Ms. Johnson continued, "Monique says you're serious about changing. So, let's see if you can prove it." She gestured toward a group of teenagers sitting in a circle. "That's your group," Ms. Johnson said. "Good luck." Samantha approached cautiously. The teens went silent as she sat down. One of them, a tall boy in a hoodie, leaned back and smirked. Wait," he said. "Ain't that the racist lady from the news?" Laughter rippled through the group. Samantha's face burned. A girl with braids crossed her arms. "Why are you even here?" she demanded. "You get fired from being racist and now you want to pretend you care about us?" Samantha felt humiliated, but she had no right to defend herself. She took a deep breath. "I can't change what I did," she admitted. "And I don't expect you to forgive me. But I want to listen. I want to understand. That's why I'm here." Silence. The teens exchanged glances. Finally, one of them, a quiet boy named Elijah, spoke up. "We'll see," he muttered. Samantha knew she had a long way to go, but at least she had taken the first step. The first few weeks were rough. The kids didn't trust her. She could feel their skepticism in every conversation. Elijah, the quiet boy, was the only one who didn't openly mock her, but even he kept his distance. One day, during a discussion about racial profiling, one of the teens, Aisha, turned to Samantha with a challenging look. How would you feel if every time you walked into a store, people assumed you were a criminal? She asked. Samantha froze. That was exactly what she had done to Michael Carter. I don't know, Samantha admitted. I never thought about it before. Exactly, Aisha snapped. You never had to think about it. But we do every damn day. Samantha felt a deep shame settle in her stomach. But for the first time, she didn't try to defend herself. Instead, she listened. And slowly, very slowly, the walls around her began to crack. One evening, as Samantha was leaving the community center, she found Elijah sitting alone outside. She hesitated before approaching him. You okay? She asked. Elijah shrugged. Just thinking. Samantha sat beside him. About what? He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, You know, people like you don't usually come here. And if they do, they don't stay. Samantha swallowed. I'm still here. Elijah studied her carefully. Yeah, he admitted. You are. A small silence stretched between them. Then, unexpectedly, he asked, Why did you do it? Samantha's throat tightened. Do what? Judge him, Elijah said. The mayor. You didn't even know him, but you thought he was a thief. Why? Samantha felt the weight of the question settle on her chest. She could make excuses. She could say she was just doing her job. But that wasn't the truth. The truth was uglier. I think I was taught to see people like him that way. She admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. And I never questioned it. Elijah nodded slowly, as if he had expected that answer. At least you're questioning it now, he said. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was something. And for the first time, Samantha felt like she was finally beginning to understand. Samantha White had spent months trying to piece together her life after it had been shattered by one fateful mistake. She had gone from a respected cashier with a stable job to a national disgrace. From a woman who never questioned her beliefs to someone who was finally learning. But was it enough? Each day at the community center, she felt both progress and resistance. Some of the teenagers in her mentorship group had softened toward her, but others still viewed her with deep skepticism. Samantha understood why. Trust wasn't given, it was earned. One evening, after a long session where the group discussed systemic racism in education, Isha, one of her toughest critics, pulled her aside. I still don't trust you, Aisha said bluntly, but I'll admit, at least you're trying. Samantha let out a small breath. That was the closest thing to an approval she had gotten from Aisha since the program started. She looked at the young woman in front of her, so intelligent, so strong, so full of potential, and realized something. This wasn't just about fixing her own reputation anymore. It was about using what she had learned to help others. And that meant she had to do more. The next day, Samantha approached Ms. Johnson, the program coordinator. I want to do more than just mentor the kids, she said. I want to help on a larger scale. Ms. Johnson raised an eyebrow. How? Exactly? I want to start a program that focuses on getting employment opportunities for people who've been discriminated against. Samantha explained. I know what it's like to be unhireable because of a reputation, but some of these kids, they never even had a chance in the first place. I want to change that. Ms. Johnson studied her for a long time before finally speaking. You really have changed, haven't you? She said. Samantha felt a lump in her throat. I hope so. Then let's see what we can do. And just like that, a new mission was born. A few weeks later, Samantha stood on a stage at the community center, facing a crowd of people. Among them was Mayor Michael Carter. He had agreed to attend the launch of Samantha's new initiative, a program designed to help disadvantaged youth find jobs and mentorship. It was a surreal moment. The same man she had once humiliated was now witnessing her attempt to make things right. She stepped up to the microphone, her hands trembling slightly. 6 months ago, she began. I made a mistake that changed my life. But what I've learned is that mistakes don't define us. What we do afterward does. A hush fell over the room. I assumed things about people I had never taken the time to understand. She continued. And in doing so, I hurt not just one person, but an entire community. She paused, gathering her courage. I can't erase what I did, she admitted. But I can dedicate my life to making sure others don't make the same mistake. A few people in the audience nodded, their expressions softening. From the front row, Michael Carter watched her carefully, his face unreadable. Samantha's heart pounded. Then, he did something she never expected. He stood up and clapped. A few others followed. And then the entire room erupted into applause. Tears burned at Samantha's eyes. She had spent so long fearing she would never be forgiven. And maybe, she never would be, not completely. But this was enough. She had been given a chance to do better. And she wouldn't waste it. Samantha's new initiative, the Second Chance program, began making real progress. With funding from the mayor's office, she and Ms. Johnson were able to start placing young people in internships, job training programs, and mentorship roles. Many of the teenagers who once doubted her sincerity were now active participants in the program. One day, as Samantha walked into the community center, she found Elijah waiting for her. He had been the most distant of all the teens, but also the one who had challenged her the most. You know, he said, shifting awkwardly, I applied for one of those jobs you got set up. Samantha's eyes widened. That's amazing, she said. Where? At a tech firm downtown. Elijah muttered. I didn't think I'd even get an interview, but they called me back. Samantha felt a rush of emotion. Elijah had spent weeks telling her the system was against people like him, and he was right. But now, because of this program, he was getting a chance he never thought he'd have. I'm proud of you, she said softly. Elijah smirked. Don't get all emotional on me now, lady. Samantha laughed, blinking back tears. For the first time in her life, she was doing something that mattered, and it felt right. One evening, Samantha received a call from Michael Carter. Meet me at Brightmart, he said. Her stomach twisted. She hadn't set foot in that place since the day her life imploded. But if the mayor was asking, she had no choice. When she arrived, she found Michael standing at the checkout counter, the very same one where she had accused him. The sight of it sent a wave of shame and regret crashing over her. You remember this place? He asked. Samantha swallowed hard. I'll never forget it. Michael turned to face her. You lost a lot because of what you did, he said. But do you regret it? Samantha didn't hesitate. Yes, she said. But not just because of what happened to me. I regret who I used to be. I regret not questioning myself sooner. Michael nodded slowly. Then you've learned the most important lesson. Samantha glanced around the store. Other employees were watching her, some whispering. The manager, Mr. Holloway, stepped forward. We heard about what you've been doing, he said. You've come a long way. She braced herself for what was coming next. But if you ever need a job again, Mr. Holloway said, I think we might be able to make space for you. Samantha's eyes widened. She had spent months believing she would never get a second chance. And now, she was being offered one. She looked at Michael, who gave her a knowing smile. Then she turned back to Mr. Holloway. Thank you, she said. But I think I've found my real calling. She wasn't the same woman who had stood behind this counter, blind to her own prejudice. She had changed, and that was worth more than any job. As she walked out of Brightmart for the last time, she knew one thing for certain. The cost of prejudice had been high, but the reward of growth? That was priceless.